Well, welcome from cloudy Ithaca, New York. Thank you for joining us today. A lot has changed in the last couple of years, but a major shift has happened surrounding work. Many people have swapped driving to work for walking up or down the stairs or down the hall. We're talking hybrid work models, navigating new challenges and opportunities. These models represent a major shift in how work gets done. Now, every business may have their own definition of hybrid work, but it's exciting to see a growing number of different designs. We've also witnessed the benefits of workers and organizations that come with increased flexibility. But despite many benefits, hybrid work models also present some unique challenges. Today, I'm joined by ILR Professor Brad Bell and Dyson Professor Donna Haeger. Some questions we'll be answering for you include, what are some strategies for navigating these new work models? How a hybrid work model approach can be adjusted by leadership, and how we should manage group culture and productivity when some are remote and others are in the office. But first, we want to hear a little bit from you, the audience. So scan the QR code on your screen. We'll be asking you a series of poll questions to help us kind of tailor our conversation. So our first question we want to ask you is, do you work solely from home, in the office, or a nice little mixture of both? Now, as we wait for some of your responses here, we want to remind you that this is being recorded. So if there is anything you missed or anything like that, you can of course go back and rewatch it. We also want our conversation today to be as interactive as possible. So submit some of your questions in the chat, and you can also submit those in our Slido poll as well. The chat box is right up there on the top right of the player. And we are getting some responses. So it looks like we have a nice mixture of people working in the office and in the home. It looks like we have about roughly 70% that has a nice mixture of office and home. So that is perfect. So let's baseline our conversation today. I want to start with Brad, who's actually joining us remotely, coincidentally. Now, Brad, what is hybrid work, and what are some of the different forms that it can take?
Hi, Nick. Great to be with you today. I think a key aspect of hybrid work is really that it kind of mixes both virtual and in-person work models. This is really what makes it different than more traditional in-office work, as well as kind of purely virtual work, is that it really blends these two work styles. Now, that being said, there are, as you mentioned, many different types of hybrid work. It can take many different types of configurations. Although it seems like a lot of organizations are converging on kind of two main models. The first being the role-specific model, in which individuals are assigned to a particular type of work arrangement based on their role and the type of work tasks that they do. So the goal in this type of model is really to think about, given the type of work, the tasks, the type of interactions that a person needs in their day-to-day, what type of work model fits best? That might be purely virtual, it might be purely in the office, or it might be some mix of those. The second type of model is the split schedule model, in which all individuals have some mixture of in-person and virtual work. And here, that can be defined by the organization or managers, for example, saying we're going to have a 3-2 model where employees are in the office 3 days and work from home 2 days. Or some organizations are leaving that more to the discretion of the employees themselves. I think what's really important to understand about these different models is that they have advantages and disadvantages. There's not one single perfect model. Take the role-specific model, for example. The benefit of that model is that it really allows us to tailor the work arrangement to the individual. Really thinking through, where does this person need to be to do their best work? And that allows us to really provide a very individualized type of work experience for each employee. Now, what's the downside of that model? The downside is that you could end up in a unit or a team with individuals working across a variety of different work models. Again, some people might be purely virtual, some people might be entirely in the office, and some people might be doing that blended hybrid approach. This can create challenges in terms of, are we treating all those employees the same? Are there perceptions of unfairness because maybe I don't seem to be getting the same attention or the same assignments as my coworkers that are maybe in the office more? So these present real challenges for both managers and employees to work through. And, I think we'll see some of these themes later in today's presentation, but this raises a host of the challenges that you mentioned earlier around things like, how do we make sure that we blend these different work models to sustain our culture and productivity in our organizations? How do we make sure that employees don't get siloed into subgroups based on their work models, that we don't get these factions of the remote versus the in-office employees? And finally, leaders really have to adjust their styles and be very conscious about the differences that exist across employees in these work models. And as I mentioned just a second ago, make sure that they treat all those employees the same and create a level playing field across these different types of work arrangements.
And just as a quick follow-up, I want to ask you, Brad, and then I'm going to ask you, Donna, the same question. Is the hybrid work model a new concept, or has this been around for a little bit longer than we may have thought of before?
I would say it's a combination of both, Nick, in the sense that it's not entirely new. For years, we've had, for example, mixed teams, where you might have a team that has a group of individuals that's maybe co-located in the office, but maybe also has some virtual members that are working from other sites that might be at home or geographically dispersed locations. I would also say that telecommuting has for years been a kind of form of hybrid work. The full-time telecommuter is actually, or was, quite rare. The more common scenario was that employees, again, worked at home 3, sometimes 4 days a week, but also worked in the office several days a week. So that, in a sense, is also a form of hybrid. I think what's different today as we really kind of embrace these hybrid models is two things. One is hybrid models today, I think, are much more dynamic. I think what we're going to see is employees, as I mentioned, working across a variety of different work models. And I think we'll also see those work models shifting over time. So an employee, for example, might not always be on a 3-2 schedule based on what they're working on at any particular time. Maybe one week they have to be in the office 5 days a week. Another week they can be at home 5 days. And other times they really need to split their time. So this will create a lot of kind of dynamic, changing nature of work that managers and organizations will have to wrestle with. And I think the other key difference is just scale. Before the pandemic, if we looked at various surveys, individuals that regularly telecommuted, that was about 1/3 to maybe 40% of the population of workers. I think what we're seeing today is that these hybrid models in many organizations are going to become the predominant way that employees work, where they can work that way. So I think both the kind of dynamic nature as well as our more widespread adoption does create a new landscape as we think about hybrid work.
And Donna, same question.
Yes, thank you. Great outline, Brad, and I totally agree. Role-specific and split schedule are, I think, what we would call new. And what's new about that is we have a name for it now. There have been inklings over time in terms of the hybrid or that mix of work, but so much more prevalent now. And that's important. It's important to understand what style of hybrid we're looking at, what is hybrid, and how do we treat hybrid? How do we do it in a way that is most productive? What's also new is the job shifting that's happening right now. As organizations are defining and redefining roles and required methods of attendance, people are choosing which organizations and best jobs fit what they prefer, what their preferred method of attendance is, and also what is the required method of attendance at a particular organization. So this differs not only from industry to industry, but from person to person. So we're in the midst of a very big shuffle here in terms of this new method and this new model because it's so much more prevalent.
And as a nice follow-up to you, Donna, as well, what's your experience been like over this last, year, 2 years? It seems like it's been forever, but what's your experience been like, working and teaching hybrid compared to in-person, compared to completely remote? What's your experience been like?
It's been really interesting. And what I've learned are a few things. There's number one, technology. Everyone's working at a different skill level. Different tools, disparate connectivity. This creates different levels of comfort for everyone and thus a different pace of getting the work done. We have to be mindful of that. Timing is different based on world location. Colleagues, students can be across the world, bringing the time difference to 12 hours. This means that conducting work and communicating from one person at 9 a.m. requires another person to be on board at 9 p.m. So as an example, as a teacher during the pandemic when students were in very different time zones, I hired teaching assistants who were willing to support students during evening hours to share the burden of time difference. This allowed students who do the work in the morning, the students who were willing to support students in the evening could help those students who were 12 hours away to actually do some work in the morning versus always being forced to work at night, and vice versa. So having the right technology, getting the work done, and then staying connected with the colleagues and the students is really kind of a trifecta challenge for hybrid work.
I guess I've never thought about that before, having, one person at 9 a.m., another person on the West Coast, and balancing those hour differences. I guess that's one thing I never really thought about.
Yeah, it's super challenging, and you can't expect one person to always be on at 9 p.m. just because they live 12 hours away. And so we really have to accommodate one another and be thoughtful of how we do that.
And now several surveys show that a large portion of organizations have or are planning to adopt hybrid work to some extent. Now, what is driving the growth in these models?
Well, first off, we learned that it can be done, which is good news. And we may have gone into it reluctantly, but we're adapting. And that's the key to getting these models to work, is the adaptation. There's major value add to making sure that we're remaining productive, but that we're also focusing on the culture. So, for instance, in terms of organization and leadership, we learned that the switch to remote work helped us to kind of dispel a number of long-term standing myths, such as employees can't be productive when working virtually. This helped us and many organizations and leaders to kind of open up to alternative ways of working. Organizations also recognize that hybrid work can lead to cost savings related to travel and real estate expenses. We learned that technology designed well and used wisely can in fact support work where employees are not co-located. In terms of employees, similarly, many employees got their first taste of remote work during the pandemic, some on a major learning curve, and experienced the autonomy and the flexibility that can offer. From just the results of the survey indicate that some people were like, I didn't think I would like that, but you know what? This is kind of cool. So there's this flexibility now in terms of the balance. So the result is that while most employees still want to spend time working on site, they also want more flexibility, more than they had prior to the pandemic. So go ahead.
No, I was listening intently, and I'm sure we have some managers on call now. I want to ask you, Donna, how should management approach working from a hybrid model or working in a hybrid meeting? How should they approach that with some employees maybe in the office, some at home, and a mix?
I think it's really important to focus on both the productivity, right? Because that's never going away. The whole point is that we're doing our jobs to be a productive organization, but we do also need to make sure that there is high emphasis now on the culture. And what I mean by this is that we need to not just be task focused. Since we're applying a model where employees are not co-located, the challenge will be to nurture a strong hybrid work culture. Easy to get wrapped up in getting the work done and become taskmasters at what we're doing, but we can't forget about how people are interacting. How do we bring them all together? That's not doing that is kind of a recipe for a failed hybrid work group. So there's lots of examples that I can share, but basically for work groups to be successful, they need to meet only, they can't only focus on the task, but getting the work done, but also the relationships, create that inclusivity, satisfying experiences for everyone who's involved.
It seems like experiences is really kind of a major factor in there, having that in-person kind of connection with maybe some of your team members compared to just kind of a cold screen.
Absolutely.
And now, Brad, I want to kind of loop you in here. We saw a large amount of people quitting their jobs and changing careers, of course, during the pandemic, the Great Resignation, all that. I want to know, does the hybrid model change hiring practices with some people not wanting to work exactly in the office or not wanting to work entirely in the office?
I think certainly, Nick, that the turbulence that we've seen in the talent market has further stimulated some of these trends that we're talking about today. As an example, we did some research here through our Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies in late 2020, early 21 on remote work and asked companies, where do you think you'll be when the pandemic ends? And at that time, about 35% of the companies that we talked to said, as soon as the pandemic's done, they're going back to the way work was done previously. What then happened, and you alluded to, is then we had the Great Resignation. We had a lot of employees, as Don also mentioned, shifting jobs and moving jobs. And I think that really forced those companies that said, we're just going to go back to the way it was before, to really rethink that, because employees want and expect flexibility. And if companies aren't going to offer that, I think employees, particularly in today's talent market where unemployment remains really low, they have a lot of choices. And so they'll go to companies that will offer those types of benefits to them, particularly if other competitors in your own industry are offering those types of benefits. So, we're seeing this a lot in the tech industry where you have, some companies saying, we're staying fully remote, others saying we're bringing people back in the office. I think it's really kind of creating this competitive talent market, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think what also will be really interesting to see is, what happens if these predictions about, a potential recession or at least a slowdown in the economy happen. We've already seen some employers, large employers, signaling that they're starting to pull back on hiring, they're freezing hiring. We're even seeing some companies starting to engage in some layoffs. If that happens, what will be the implications for these flexible work practices? Will companies say, well, now we have the upper hand and we're going to go back to the way it was? Or will, to Donna's point, will there be enough momentum? We've figured this out. We can see that we can be productive. And will we continue down that path? Personally, I'm really interested to see how this plays out over the next year or two, depending on some of these market forces and the impact that they have.
Mm-hmm. And I have another poll question, but I just actually got a really, really great audience question from Mr. Kumar. Mr. Kumar asks, I work remotely with my team. What sort of exercises can we do to engage team members more? And maybe, Brad, you can take us off, and then Donna, I'll ask you the same question.
Yeah, I would start with the point that Donna raised around, culture, and your point too, Nick, that a lot of it is about the experience of connecting with your coworkers. When we're in the office, that happens naturally. That happens informally. We have a meeting, people walk into the conference room, we sit down, we chit chat with people before the meeting starts. There's that natural kind of relationship building that just occurs. Or we run into someone in the hallway or by the water cooler. That doesn't happen in remote work. And in fact, to Donna's point, research shows that virtual and remote teams are much more likely to just dive right into the task-based components and focus very little attention on those social components. So what I've seen organizations and teams do is really take time to engage in those kind of social interactions. Spend some time at the beginning of a meeting, just some unstructured time for people to share whatever they want. Talk about what's happening in the workplace, talk about what's happening in your own personal life. Mm-hmm. I've seen other companies or teams take that to the next level where employees will share, panoramic pictures of things that they did maybe on their summer vacation or, what they, other things that are important to them in their lives. But the whole point is that when you're a remote and virtual team, you really need to be purposeful, systematic, and planful about creating and orchestrating those opportunities because they're not going to occur just by happenstance. And so you need to make sure that you build it into your team's rhythm and everyday types of interactions.
It's funny you mentioned pictures. I have a newborn, and every morning my team's like, I want to see a picture of your newborn.
Because they change so quickly.
They do. They change very quickly. So it's funny you mentioned that, Brad. But I also wanted to get your thoughts, Donna.
Yeah.
What advice would you give Mr. Kumar?
Well, I couldn't agree more with Brad, and I think it's really important to be mindful because when people have really good experiences at work and they feel included, they're more productive, and that's really great for everyone. There are many things that you can build into meetings, whether the organization requires you to build them in or the individuals in that particular work group decide to build them in, some kind of an etiquette around what are we going to do. Adding time to a particular meeting to have the small chit chat is a really great idea, but you can also designate some personal time, some meetings that are not about the formal meeting and not about the procedural project management piece, but hey, let's get together and just catch up on things, what's going on, to continue to build that camaraderie, right? To have those bonding experiences. It's okay to do that, and it's probably going to become more normal.
I think team building is...
Maybe if I could just add one more thing, because I think we're talking about the kind of relationship building. Mm-hmm. I think the other piece of the question was around engaging the team. And I think What's also very important in virtual settings is that as a leader, team leader, that you really be careful about making sure that everybody has an opportunity to engage, participate, and have voice in meetings. That's very easy. It's very easy in virtual settings for people to drop into the background, turn their camera off or just simply sit there quietly, and to have the few loud voices in the room really dominate that discussion. Certainly that can happen in person too, but there's more kind of nonverbal cues. People start squiggling in their chair, maybe kind of, acting disinterested, or, looking at the person side eye, giving them signals that, hey, it's time for you to, cede the floor to someone else. But in virtual settings, that doesn't happen. And so as a leader, you really have to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to take turns speaking, everybody has a chance for input. And again, there is research that shows that teams that do that in a virtual environment, that have more even distribution of speaking, actually have much better performance and outcomes than those that don't. So that's a key part of engagement in this setting as well, beyond just building those relationships.
Now, Donna, should we have our cameras on during meetings?
Well, do you know what? That has to do with the group. It has to do with, there are two different ways to set these policies, and I'm sure Brad would agree that organizations will set some of the guidelines for how this hybrid work is set up, but then the groups, those sub-work groups will also and should be able to decide. Employees are the key input to getting this work done, and so setting those ground rules, and I call it meeting etiquette, setting the etiquette about each of those groups will be about what kind of work are we doing? Is it necessary? Just like defining the new roles in these jobs, that some of these positions, like first responders, should be 100% in person. Some can be a little bit of both, and some can be 100% virtual. Just like setting that up, it's going to be about what is the project we're on, what type of work are we doing, do we need our videos on or not? It's really, really important.
Meeting etiquette, one thing to take away from today. Remember that one. And that actually brings us to our second viewer question. So like I mentioned in my intro, we have a nice QR code where you can scan that. So our second question is for our audience: do you prefer working solely at home? Do you prefer working maybe solely in the office, or a nice combination of both? And we'll kind of wait for your responses there. And I want to thank the audience for continuing to get in those audience questions there. And it looks like, wow. Most people prefer, or actually,
oh, here it goes. It updated.
basically everybody prefers a nice mixture of both. I know me personally, I like working in the office. It's just one of those things. I want to thank the audience for your responses. And I actually wanted to follow that up with a great question that I just got from Steve in our audience. So Steve asked, with a mix of hybrid, both obviously in the office and at home, and fully remote members, how do we approach team building?
It can be a challenge, especially because we're used to a lot of the team building being in person, and that's okay. Some people actually do prefer that, even though we're working sometimes remote, sometimes live, we are going to be geographically dispersed, and that's going to become more prevalent now as organizations cast that wider net for people to work for them. But it's okay for organizations to set up a once-a-year gathering that's physical, or set up some team building online. I've actually conducted with students a really fun exercise that allows me to send each student a little bit of information, and then they have to verbally communicate with one another the information they have to solve a problem, and they're not allowed to text or chat or anything. It's just a verbal exercise, but they have a lot of fun with it, and they learn a lot about one another. So it's okay to use some of the traditional team building exercises, but apply them or adapt them to online. But yeah, those exercises are necessary so that we can kind of breed those strong relationships.
And not being able to text, I'm thinking about the generation coming up. I'm sure that must be difficult for them to not be able to text. And I want to ask Brad this next question. So Brad, do we have an idea of percentage of the workforce that prefers working from home or remote compared to a mix of both? I know our audience mostly works roughly hybrid, so a little mix of both. But do we have a broader percentage of maybe the larger workforce?
Yeah, I think the surveys I've seen, Nick, really reflect the results that you just got through the poll, which is, majority of employees indicate or signal that they prefer a mix. They want flexibility. They want actually more flexibility than they probably had pre-pandemic, if they had any. And that's really the desire. The number of employees that want purely remote or fully in the office is more in the minority. These surveys are a bit tricky because I've seen numbers all over the place. They've also changed quite a bit as we've looked at them over the last 2 years. I think early in the pandemic, employees were first kind of figuring it out. There was a lot of kind of bumps in the road. So the number of people saying they wanted remote or hybrid was a bit lower. Then a bit into the pandemic, I think people figured it out and were like, oh, this isn't so bad. And in fact, I don't have to commute in the office. There's all these ancillary benefits. So we saw the desire for that go up. And then as people were 2 years into it and, lacking the social contact, we saw it, come back down a bit. So I think any of these surveys, it's less about the precise numbers and percentages, but it's more about where do we see the general trends? And the general trend is certainly that a majority of employees, but not all employees, want that flexibility. They want that opportunity to work in the office when it makes sense, but also work at home to reap some of those benefits.
And just as a quick follow-up, I'm interested to know if there's a difference between generations. So do, older folks who may not be so tech savvy, do they like to work completely in the office? Or do younger generations who may be more tech savvy, do they like working remotely? Is there any type of research regarding the difference in generations and age?
I haven't seen a lot of research yet on this, Nick. I'll just tell you anecdotally, talking to a number of organizations that have been kind of navigating return to work and return to office, and what they've seen that the kind of younger generation as well as more senior employees prefer more in-office work. Why would that be? Well, for the younger generation, they're starting their careers. They want that, interaction with their coworkers. They want that social contact, but they also realize, probably not mistakenly, that FaceTime is probably good, right? It's probably going to help me in my career. And there is research to support that the more employees work virtually, it can have some negative career implications. That's something that organizations really have to watch out for. More senior employees, it's probably what they're familiar with. It's what they're most comfortable with. The population that I've heard really most values flexibility and hybrid remote work is kind of mid-career employees. And that's likely because they're the ones with the most kind of non-work responsibilities, childcare, elder care, other things that, really that flexibility really helps them better manage. But I'll add to that too. I think it's important as we look at any of these trends, or if research at some point shows that there are generational differences, that's on the average. We need to recognize that every employee, regardless of what age they are, what generation they are, is going to have their own needs, their own preferences, their own work styles. So we need to be careful as organizations and managers not to say, oh, this employee is in the 20 to 35 category, so of course they'll want to be in the office full time. Maybe they don't for a variety of different reasons. And that's really the value of understanding your employees' needs and desires and preferences and trying as much as possible within boundaries to tailor to that.
If I could add to that, so I do quite a bit of research on generations and how they leverage technology, and so we're really ripe now to start gathering information. I would answer that question by saying too soon to tell. We can't wait to find this out, but also it's important to know that even in the research that I've done in terms of what generation uses what technology to solve what problem at work, because not only are, let's just use millennials and boomers as an example. Millennials use different tools than boomers do, and if they do use the same tool, they're usually solving a different problem with the same tool. And so that's important because ultimately at the end of the day, what we find is that how we prefer the hybrid work is going to be all about autonomy, right? And you can see that from people choosing whether they work with, the flexible, I want to be in work sometimes and I want to be remote sometimes. That is all about flexibility and autonomy. People who are satisfied with their work, satisfied with the autonomy and the flexibility they're given with their work, they have a higher level of work-life satisfaction. And that's because they feel that they are more in control of what they're doing in their job, and they have that flexibility to also tend to their personal life when they need to. That's going to make all the difference.
And just as a quick follow-up, Donna, wanted to ask you, so clearly hybrid work can offer benefits to both organizations and employees, but what about some of the challenges? What do we need to watch out for as we transition to more of a hybrid model that we may not have seen before the pandemic?
Well, going back to something that Brad said earlier, I think that when we talk about team building, we know that in the team building exercises, we're told, always be sure you bring people in. If you're in a room and you're in a meeting and someone hasn't said much, ask them, right? Ask them what their opinion is. That's going to be very, very challenging, and it's going to be really kind of one of the number one things that we need to do is make sure that we engage all of those people, because the person who is quiet is even more quiet when they're online. So that's a big, big challenge. Other things that are going to be challenges are making sure that we have the cohesiveness, because the cohesiveness is what raises people's work-life satisfaction, their job satisfaction, and what that does is that raises their productivity and their happiness in their job. Why do we care? Because it lowers turnover. People stay in their jobs. That lowers costs for organizations, which makes organizations more profitable. So there will be a lot of challenges around, again, productivity, staying coordinated with the work, but also the relationships and keeping that collaboration going.
And do we know the effect that hybrid work maybe has on kind of someone's personality? So like you mentioned before, if someone's really quiet, do we know if maybe working hybrid makes them more quiet, or makes maybe somebody that's more boisterous maybe more boisterous?
Well, there are a lot of studies on that, and I think that really we get kind of mixed answers in terms of those. So I think it's too soon to tell again where all of these things land, but very ripe for research, and I know Brad and I are both excited about that.
Mm-hmm. And we actually just got a great question in from Maria, and Maria, thank you for your question. She asked, do you have any recommendations to manage workload in hybrid world? I see that it's still a recurrent issue. So I guess managing workloads.
Me or Brad? Me?
We'll go to you first.
Okay, so managing workload in hybrid, that's all about the coordination as well, and it is really, really important. It's very easy for those who are virtual to sort of be tasked 24/7 with getting things done because they're not in the office, and that's sort of a stigma, and it's unfair, and we need to work our way through that. It's going to be those project management tools, those tools that list accountability and who is working on what. So when we talk about coordination, it's about who has been assigned what work, is that work getting done, and really the manager's position will be to determine, is this too much work or too little work. It'll also be important for people, right, to share whether they feel they're burning out or not. So again, communication is going to be key.
And I have another great question that just came in from audience member Steve. So Steve asks, are we seeing if employees are more productive remotely or in the office? Maybe Brad, you can answer this one, and then we'll go over to Donna.
Yeah, I'll say, based on research, Nick, the research suggests that there's maybe a small productivity gain actually when employees are working remotely. I think the big kind of contingency there is that remote work is a fit for that person's job, right? That they can easily do their tasks remotely, and that there's not inefficiencies or barriers created to doing that. If that's the case, if their work is a good fit for remote, and you take that employee, compare them working in an office to working at home, studies have shown there is a small productivity gain, usually in this range of somewhere between 5 and 10%. Why is that? Research has basically come to two main explanations. The first is, if you're working at home, you're less likely to call out sick. If you're a little bit under the weather one day, where it might be a struggle to, do your daily commute and get up and get dressed and go in the office. But, if you just have to go downstairs or, to your private office and do your work and, in your own home, employees are less likely to call out sick if they're a bit under the weather. So there's a bit of a productivity gain just based on absenteeism and things like that. And second is just interruptions. When employees are working from home, they're less likely to be interrupted for a variety of reasons. and that allows them to focus more time on tasks, which again leads to small productivity, gains. But again, I would say that big caveat is the type of work, because I think you could look on the flip side. A lot of these studies have been with people such as call center jobs, other things like that, which are very kind of individual contributor jobs. If you take someone that's working in a very collaborative environment, working on innovation, creativity, where their work product is really a function of working closely with others, then there might be inefficiencies created by having to go remote and do all of that virtually as opposed to in the office. So again, I don't think there's one model that's always going to lead to more or less productivity. It's going to be the match between the job and the work model itself.
Interesting. And I actually just got another great question from Caroline. Maybe you can help us answer this one, Donna. So Caroline asked, is there any thoughts on salaries for employees in different parts of the country, i.e. a New York City-based company with an employee in a rural area? Should the pay be based on the home company or the location of the employee?
That is a great question, and I'm here to tell you that there are organizations across the country that are actually creating pay scales based on geographic location and cost of living. So that is happening. And it is in fact true that if someone works for a company and moves from one geolocation to another geolocation, their income can actually be adjusted up or down depending on where they're living and what the cost of living is. So that is happening in some companies, and it's very possible that that could become more prevalent as we move forward with this.
And I'll just build on that, noting that on the flip side, there are companies that are saying, for example, many companies in Silicon Valley where employees have exited that area, which we know is a very high cost of living area, have said, we're going to pay employees their same salary as they were when they were living here, even if they've, relocated to a less expensive market. And so I think what we're seeing is companies all over the map on this one, still really trying to figure out what to pay people at a time when they're struggling with other compensation and total rewards issues around inflation and other things. It's really a very challenging compensation landscape. And this is, this relocation piece is just one of the many factors that companies are wrestling with as they try to get this under control.
If I might circle back to the idea of burnout and productivity, I really think that, if I may hypothesize, I really think that the focus should be more on burnout than lower productivity. And I'll tell you why. In my experience, people who are working from home, because they don't have to get in the car and leave, they don't actually leave their office. They do tend to work more hours, and they do tend to default to, I have a free moment, I'm going to get back on my computer. And so the productivity has gone up slightly, as Brad said, but I think what's important to note is it's possible that burnout could go up. And so we have to really keep an eye on both of those.
And are there ways that we can avoid that? I know we're, obviously home and our office is right next to us, or maybe even right next to our bed. Are there ways we can kind of avoid this?
Well, I think it's important to set policies, but also to remind, right? There's a lot of well-being reminders that we can send to our employees to say, be sure you take time for yourself. And there are organizations that are giving Friday afternoons off and things like that. And so, yeah, it's a matter of reminding our employees that we value them, but we also want them to take time for themselves because that's at the end of the day, in the long run, you're going to get more from your employee.
And we spoke a little bit about culture early on in our conversation. But Rupert actually asked, we just got a question in from him. So he asked, how do you cultivate empathy in a remote environment?
That's challenging, and it's something that we really need to focus on. Cultivating empathy is actually, in a way, could be part of the relationship building, right? Because what we can do when we cultivate empathy, what we want to make sure we do is help people to be mindful of others. And we do that through what we call perspective taking, trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes, right? Because oftentimes we look at things from our own vantage point, and so we need to be flexible and understand, how is this person feeling? What scenario is this person in? So with empathy, our exercises in being mindful and thinking about what position that person is in.
And I'll just maybe add to that, Nick. I think one of the benefits of the pandemic I've heard from a lot of companies is that leaders and managers became much more empathetic actually in their leadership styles. I think they, for a variety of reasons. One, they recognized that everybody was in this mess together. We're all navigating it together. They recognized that employees were making tremendous sacrifices, to help keep their work and the organizations going. I think that managers also, with their employees being remote, did things like random informal touch bases, which maybe they didn't do in the office as much, right? But they did it more when those employees were working at home. And then I think there were simple things like, us being on Zoom in our homes kind of gave people a glimpse into our lives and humanized us to an extent. And I think all those things contributed to a more kind of empathetic leadership style. And I'm hoping that some of those behaviors and patterns will continue even when we're, kind of beyond this and back to a quote unquote more, normal, working pattern.
It's interesting. One thing I never thought about was my background. I never had to think about that before. But now with, me zooming into meetings now, I got to think like, okay, is this book right? Is this picture right? So I know what you both mean. And I actually just got a really interesting question from Edward, and I want to hear your thoughts first, Brad, and then we'll go to you, Donna. So Edward asks, what's your take on Goldman Sachs mandating a complete return to the office?
I think, one sector where we're seeing that quite a bit is indeed financial services. I mean, they're not the only ones. So we've seen Goldman do it. JP Morgan Chase has done that to an extent. I think companies like Bloomberg have. There's some outliers as well. Like I think Citi has allowed more of a kind of a hybrid or remote policy. So again, I think, as I mentioned earlier, as a company and an organization, I think we have to look at what are other companies in our industry doing. I think that's going to be a key driver of where companies land on this, again, because they're largely competing for the same talent. I haven't dived deep into their rationale for doing that. I'm sure they believe that that's important to their productivity, to serving clients, to driving innovation in their products and services. So maybe there's a strong kind of work-based, task-based rationale to do that. But again, I think it's easier in some sectors like financial services as opposed to others like tech, which has embraced remote and hybrid work to a much larger extent because they won't face the kind of competitive pressures to maybe offer that to employees.
Right. What do you think of that, Donna?
Well, every organization is going to take a stand on where they live, where they are on whether we're hybrid or whether we're fully virtual or whether we're fully in person. And that's okay. All companies are going to redefine themselves or remind everyone where they stand. And when they do this, this is where the job shift comes in. This is where now people will decide, do I agree with this? Is this the environment I wish to work in? Then I will stay or I will apply to Goldman Sachs. And for those people who that is not a good model for them and they would like a different method of attendance, they may decide to apply to another company that has a little bit different model. And so this is going to be happening probably for years to come. And that's really a normal progression.
And I have one last poll question that I want to get to, and I want to make sure the audience has a chance to answer this. So my very last poll question is, I want to know from the audience, what do you prefer and what do you find yourself to be most productive at? Is it at home or in the office, or maybe kind of a nice mix of both? So it seems like you mentioned, Brad, a lot of people actually find themselves more productive at home. Actually, roughly about 70% find themselves more productive at home. So that's always good to hear. And an interesting question I just thought of, and maybe Donna, you can help me answer this, is do employees or can employees feel more empowered now that they have a choice of, picking a company where maybe this company is doing a hybrid model compared to, a Goldman Sachs who's doing completely in the office? Do employees feel more empowered now?
Well, they should feel more empowered because they actually are, because they're going to seek autonomy. They're going to seek that which is most comfortable and productive for themselves personally and individually. And so, yes, being able to work in an organization or choose the organization that they work for is going to make them happy. Also, being able to choose within the organization how they work is going to make them feel like they have more autonomy and make them feel more satisfied. So organizations have to understand that people will shift from one organization to the other, but also they need to tend to internally, for all of the people that they have, are we allowing people the freedom to work the way they want to work?
And what are some things that maybe, management or human resources should be conscious of, knowing that, some employees may choose to not work for a company or work for a company just based on if they have hybrid work or not?
I think eventually what we're going to find is that, for instance, organizations like Goldman Sachs that would like everyone to be 100% in the building, you'll notice from the surveys that 2/3 of people prefer a little bit of both. It's possible that down the road, the organizations who choose the fully in-person, and again, I'm speculating based on the statistics we've just seen, may find that they're struggling to find people to apply. Now, they can cast a wider net now, but if they're casting a wider net and they want in-person, they have to move people, and the people who are willing to move may not be as voluminous. So there can be challenges.
And I have a great question that actually just came in from Sharon. So Sharon asks, can you speak more about adding to the culture, especially if the culture may be suffering already as a result of working remotely due to COVID? We're looking to transition to a hybrid work environment, but we're still grappling with fallout from going virtual. So it looks like Sharon's kind of trying to grapple with this question.
Well, there's a course coming out from eCornell called Hybrid Learning Essentials or Hybrid Work Essentials. And everyone is still grappling. It's really very new. And we're trying to make sure that we create a format and guidance and ideas around how do we do this? How do we keep this culture going? And even with cultures that are already suffering, applying some of these strategies, hopefully continuously will help with creating a better work environment.
And I actually just thought of a really interesting question. Maybe Brad, you can answer this one, and then I'll follow up with you, Donna. Is say COVID didn't happen, that would be nice. But say COVID didn't happen, did we see a lot of companies start to transition to a hybrid model, or did COVID kind of force a lot of companies to transition to a hybrid model?
I think it largely forced most companies to transition to this model. The research that I mentioned earlier that we did through our center back in 2021, we found that, pre-pandemic, I think it was only about maybe 20% of the companies that we talked to really embraced hybrid or remote work as a kind of normal operating practice. A lot of companies had remote work as an exception. Hey, I have a repair person coming to the house today. Can I work from home today because of that? Most companies had that type of flexibility, but the flexibility I'm talking about is where on a regular basis, I get to work at home on a weekly schedule. And so I think the pandemic has really accelerated that for many of the reasons that Donna mentioned earlier. It's broken down some of the myths. It's shown us that we can do it. I think it's opened a Pandora's box, and how the employees have experienced it. They're sitting around saying, do I want to go back to the way it was? Spending 2, 3, 4 hours of my day in a commute? No, thanks. So I think all those things have created a momentum that it's just not going to be held back. Again, we're going to see companies go back to their old models, like the Goldman Sachs and others, and I think that's fine. But I think at large, we've definitely seen a shift in this direction that wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have happened so quickly had we not had the pandemic.
You mentioned commuting earlier, and I'm thinking like having to drive up and down the hills in the snow. Obviously, here in Ithaca, it's brutal. Now, Dawn, we were talking a little bit about kind of the wear and tear of, working a lot more at home and taking breaks and everything like that. And I just got a great question in from Emmett. So they ask, in Europe, there's a few countries that are experimenting or transitioning into a 32-hour work week and having their employees still getting paid for 40 hours a week. Do you see the U.S. companies adopting this model maybe?
It's possible that some will adopt this model. As I mentioned earlier, some companies have allowed their employees to take the Friday afternoons off, and I'm not aware that they've reduced salary for that. And so, yeah, that's something that can happen, and it'll be really interesting to see if we get the same amount of work done in 32 hours.
And as a great follow-up, Mary actually asks, what are the risks of digital overload? How can we set guidelines to avoid digital fatigues and with, email, Slack, phones, all that stuff? How can we set some kind of digital guidelines?
That's a great question. And one of the things that I always tell people is it's really important for organizations to remember not to adopt too many tools at once, because what happens is there's a fatigue associated with learning and using all of these different technologies. So there's diminishing returns in trying to stay connected as well. Most importantly are the standard rules, which are turn things off, give yourself a break, right? Turn your email off except for a certain part of the day. Give yourself some quiet time. If it is your lunchtime, turn everything off. These are also etiquette guidelines that you can set up within your group. And that can be something that you do. This is quiet hour. These are work hours. This is the time we're going to ping each other, etc. Because yeah, that pinging can drive you mad while you're trying to concentrate on something, right? And I do that. I have to turn off my email, my phone, and everything if I'm doing something that's really cerebral. And we all need to do that, or we can't get the work done because it takes so much time to get back into what we were concentrating on.
I'm thinking just, of my email constantly binging and me continuing to get Slacks and stuff like that. So it's yes, definitely feeling that for sure. And as a great follow-up question again from Aaron, and Aaron, thank you for this question. Aaron asks, with more remote workers, are employers providing more stipends for phone internet use? And this, maybe Brad or Donna, you can answer.
I haven't seen a lot of employers providing stipends specifically for phone and internet. I think there's perhaps wrongly an assumption that most employees have access to those types of technology. What I am seeing employers provide stipends for are things like home office setup, chairs, desks, ergonomic-ish, things to make sure that employees are in a kind of safe and comfortable environment. Some organizations have done that, specifically for certain items, like, we'll reimburse you for a nice chair and desk and workstation. Other companies have given a flat stipend, here's $500, use it as you want, or you can even donate it to a charity if you don't need it and you already have a nice office, set up. But that's more what I've seen. We did research on telecommuting going back even a decade, and even then, when mobile phones and smartphones were becoming more prevalent, even then most companies were getting rid of stipends for their smartphones and internet, because they just assumed, again, employees are going to have these things already. But I think Donna raised earlier, we can't always assume that. And there might be some employees that do need special technology to make sure that they do have the connectivity they need. Maybe they're in a rural area where they really need satellite or something else that goes beyond just the normal. And I think we need to be willing to make exceptions so that all of our employees have the proper technology to do their jobs.
If you go back to some of the conversations we've been having, and we've talked about that each industry is different, and I keep thinking to myself, IT industry is different. And it's true that when we ask questions like, were we ever remote before? Were there ever these arrangements before? I think IT departments and IT companies are a little bit ahead of us in terms of this, because they have been doing it. And those are companies that are more likely to provide an Apple, iPhone, so that it's easier to connect, etc. But again, it's a bigger learning curve and a bigger adjustment for organizations who really haven't done that in the past.
And I actually just got another great question from our audience member. Thank you so much for this. They asked, what's your advice on treating two team members equally in terms of flexibility? If one of them is experienced enough and can work from home compared to maybe a new team member who will benefit from kind of working in the office and having that kind of hands-on experience?
Yeah, orientation programs are starting to build in that requirement to be in person. There's a lot of mentoring that happens in person, right? And we don't want to lose that. So again, that's one of those things that's an organizational policy issue, and organizations can decide that the mentoring that's required and the training that's required will involve some of that in-person work. that's not out of the question, and it's not unheard of. I've heard of that being added to some of the formats.
Now, I would just add to that, Nick, that I think a big piece of it is transparency. When I mentioned earlier, creating a level playing field, I don't think that's about treating everybody equal, because people aren't equal. As we just talked about, maybe new employees need more in-office time for socialization and mentoring. I think it's more about, what a level playing field means is it's more about equity. We're treating employees equitably. We're making decisions based on consistent standard criteria. So I think employees understand if there's set guidelines around, here's the factors that we use to make decisions about employees' work models, and that's transparent and clear to employees, I think they'll appreciate that there's going to be differences. I've seen organizations often do that based on 3 factors. How good of a fit is your job to a particular work model? What effect is this work model going to have on your team as a whole? And what effect is it going to have on the organization? Going back to Donna's point about things like real estate costs and other things, or maybe risks on the kind of more negative side. And really kind of objectively evaluating those factors, and then on that making a determination about what model an employee should be in, and communicating that decision and the rationale to of that decision to the employee. I think that can prevent a lot of issues around unfairness, as opposed to if employees just think these are ad hoc, or if they think they're being made on favoritism and other factors, that's where you're going to find problems really emerging.
And Donna, we talked a little bit about having students dial in from different area codes and things like that. But we just got a really interesting question from Rupa, who asked, can someone talk a little bit about the international culture aspect of remote work and how that affects a team's culture? For instance, a Western culture versus an Asian, Middle Eastern, or African culture, and not just specific time zones.
That's also a great question, and again, that goes to inclusivity, right? And so part of the relationship building is going to be about that inclusivity. It's going to be about the awareness and the openness and the understanding. All of the things that we've done in the past to build relationships, we have to now magnify all of our efforts that have to do with inclusivity, understanding each other's cultures, time zones, locations, how we work, what our circumstances are. Another really important one. Some people have children, some people don't. Other people have someone they're taking care of behind the scenes, that they're trying to get their job done, but someone in their life is ill and they're trying to work with that person. And so all of these circumstances, we have to be mindful of all of the differences, and that includes the cultural differences as well.
And Brad, it sounded like you wanted to hop in here real quick.
No, I think Donna captured it perfectly. And I think it goes back to our earlier points around engagement, because we know that there's cultural differences in things like speaking up, or the order in which people speak based on their authority or their position within organizations. And so we need to be very mindful of those cultural differences and make sure that we create that inclusive environment where everyone feels comfortable, everyone has an opportunity to speak up and engage in the team.
And I want to kind of, put a hat on you both for just a quick second, looking into the future. What do you see maybe 2 or 3 years from now as far as hybrid work goes, or maybe 4 or 5 years down the road? And let's start off with you, Brad.
I think I'm just as excited to see it as everyone else. I think it will be certainly more prevalent than it, is today or was, obviously pre-pandemic. I do think that I question, I guess, whether all the wild predictions will come true. Because I think what you're going to see in some organizations is that they do adopt these models and they figure out for one reason or another that it's not a fit. It doesn't fit their culture. It doesn't fit their organization. Maybe their employees don't respond well to it. So I think we'll see some organizations probably expand it because they maybe adopt it in more of a pilot phase and they realize that it really works and it takes off. I think we'll see other organizations that really go full force into either remote or hybrid and maybe realize it wasn't a great fit and self-correct. And I think that's fine. I don't think, organizations should just put a stake in the ground today and say, this is what we're going to do. And, whatever happens, that's what we're going to do for the next 3 to 5 years. I think companies should be constantly monitoring this. They should be seeing how it's affecting productivity, how it's affecting employee engagement, and they should be making adjustments based on that feedback over time to find the right model and the right mix that's really going to work for them.
And Donna, same.
Yeah, I totally agree with Brad. It's pretty chaotic right now, right? We're all trying to figure this out, individuals, organizations. And so what I'd like to see in the future is this is going to be an iterative process. It's going to be trying things, seeing how they work, engaging employees to communicate what works and what doesn't work. And hopefully we'll reach some level of equilibrium. But again, as Brad said, we'll never reach a point where this is exactly how it should work. It's really going to be based on an organization's design, the needs, the employees, the industry, et cetera. So I feel like right now it's pretty chaotic, but I think we will settle into a dull roar, I guess, and it'll be more comfortable. We'll know more, and I can't wait for all of the data.
And I know I asked the audience, but I didn't ask you both. Donna, I'll start with you. Do you prefer maybe teaching remotely, teaching hybrid, teaching in class? Which one do you prefer?
I prefer a little bit of both as well. There are certain aspects of teaching that do not lend themselves to being online. The administrative piece maybe, but not the teaching piece.
And Brad, how about you? What do you prefer?
I prefer things like teaching in person, but I do like working remotely when I have to do things like write or work on research. So again, it speaks to me the task kind of work model fit. You know, when I really want to be around others and social, in person's great. When I really want to put my head down and work, I love remote, and that works for me.
Agreed.
And I like remote as well. So one last question before we wrap up, and I want to thank the audience for your feedback. A lot of our audience is working hybrid, so in some type of mix between working in the office and at home. What's one thing you would want to leave them with, or one piece of advice that you would want them to know? And I'll start with you, Brad.
I think one piece that we've alluded to, and Donna mentioned the fact that, you know, and research has confirmed that when people work at home, that they work longer hours. And so there's this whole academic literature on what we call boundary management. And that means managing the boundaries between work and non-work life. And I think hybrid and remote work, you know, really challenges that because it blurs those boundaries. It removes a lot of the cues that signal to people, oh, I should be done with work now because everybody's left the office and the lights are out and I'm the only one here. So I think, you know, to the burnout, because research has also shown that we've seen a lot of burnout over the last 2 years. So I think if you're a remote or hybrid worker, you really need to think about managing those boundaries and come up with strategies and tactics that work for you. I'll give you a simple one. There's, you know, been a lot of, again, research on this. You know, people that are what we call high segmenters really like to keep those boundaries very firm. They'll actually put their office keys and their home keys on separate key rings. So there's no intermingling of those domains, right? That's great. But that's symbolic, but to them, it's very important to keep those domains separate. And that works for some people, but it's really finding those ways to keep those domains segmented so you can easily transition from one to the other.
And same thing, what advice would you give our audience?
Definitely, boundary management is super important. And I think that what is going to rule the day is self-awareness. Just because you think you might want to be remote or virtual doesn't mean you're good at it. And so it's really important to be self-aware. How do I work best? Should I be physically present for this part of my job? Should I be virtual? Understanding yourself and how you work the best will help you to choose what position and what organization you want to be with. And self-awareness also goes for the organization as an entity. Organizations need to understand who they are, what they represent, and which model, or in which department, which model will work best.
Donna, thank you so much for joining us. Brad, thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank the audience. Now we have one last question we want to ask. We just want to, hear how we did. So again, right on that Slido poll, submit your responses. We want to kind of hear how we did. But again, thank you so much for joining us, and have a good afternoon.